Welcome back to Snack Chats with TLB Nutrition Therapy. We're so excited to be here. I'm here with Anna today. How are you, Anna?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Sarah?
I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. For those of you who don't know us, so I am Sarah. I'm one of the team lead dietitians and then our lead outreach coordinator.
And I'm Anna. I'm also one of the team lead dietitians. And today we are going to be talking about all things macronutrients. So, what they are, what they do in our bodies, where they come from, all of that jazz.
Yes. So to start off, Anna, just tell us what is a macronutrient. So for anyone who's not familiar with that term, kind of, yeah, give us a little explanation there.
Totally. So, macronutrient, the reason they're called macro is because it is where our body derives energy from to kind of do all of like the building blocks for all of our body processes. And so when we talk about macronutrients, we are usually talking about carbohydrates, fats, or proteins. Those are going to be the main areas that our body derives energy from.
Totally. And can you kind of explain a little bit about what each, so protein, carbohydrates, and fats, what it each, what's the role that each play in our body, essentially?
Totally. So I'm going to basically explain this the way that I explain it to clients. I always start with carbohydrates, just because of everything wonderful that they do for us. I'm never going to like pit the macronutrients against each other, but carbohydrates I think are really important to start with just because that is where our body gets all of its like energy from. All of like the energetic processes kind of come from carbohydrates. So carbohydrates break down into glucose and like other sugars basically as they go through the digestive process. They get absorbed. And then I feel like most people remember like the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell type of thing from like biology. The reason that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell is because glucose gets absorbed by your cells. It goes through glycolysis, it goes through the Krebs cycle, and then it goes into the mitochondria, into the electron transport chain to make ATP, which is what our body uses for energy for like any process that it's kind of engaging in the cell. Glucose is like specifically important for the heart and the brain. And so our body will always kind of like prioritize, excuse me, even like making glucose if we're not getting enough of it. It's like that important that our body kind of like figures out how to like make it up if we're not getting enough, you know? Is there anything else that you kind of normally say about carbohydrates before I move on to protein and fat?
Well, honestly, you just like took me back to biology class. I'm like, oh my gosh, Krebs cycle. I
Krebs
forgot.
cycle. I talk about the Krebs cycle. Like,
I need to really amp up my education in sessions because I haven't talked about the Krebs cycle in a long time. But no, I think that really is the biggest thing is just carbohydrates are the main source of fuel for our body. And so it just makes them so important. Our brains can't function optimally, our bodies can't function optimally if we don't consume enough carbohydrates. So yeah, that's
totally.
really kind of where I leave it is just like if you want to feel energized and you want your body to like do these processes in an efficient way, we need carbohydrates. So I think that was a great overview.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, I think I'll talk about protein next. So, protein is like I said with carbohydrates, where it's like carbohydrates break down into glucose, protein breaks down into what are called amino acids. And that's going to be the building blocks for it. Like, I feel like a lot of times people know it's like, oh, it's like muscle, right? Which, like, when people are thinking about like muscle building and protein, I think they're thinking about like skeletal muscle. So, like, biceps, like whatever, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, that is true that like amino acids are the building blocks for like that kind of muscle. They're also the building blocks for smooth muscle, which would be all of like your organ tissues, right? So like we forget that like our entire digestive tract is a muscle, our heart is a muscle, right? Like all of those different things. It's really important for the integrity of those things. Amino acids are also the building blocks to all of our enzymes. And so enzymes are basically responsible from like turning one thing in the cell into another thing, like into a usable form of it, right? So like I was talking about like the Krebs cycle, to turn glucose into all of these different things, we need enzymes, and amino acids are going to be like the building blocks of those enzymes. Amino acids are also the building blocks for a lot of like neurotransmitters and hormones. So for a lot of things that has to do with like electrical like messaging in the system or in the body, like that kind of thing, amino acids are going to be really helpful for that. That's kind of like where I go with protein. Is there anything else that you would add to that?
Yeah, and I think that's such a good reminder about the smooth muscle, right? We're not only like building muscle on our body with proteins and movement, all of that, but like, yeah, our organs need those proteins so that they can also again like function optimally and everything. So, um, it going along with amino acids, sometimes I will talk a little bit about like essential amino acids just and if a client is maybe vegetarian or vegan, we're kind of talking through like ways to pair up different plant-based protein sources just to make sure someone's getting all of the essential amino acids. All that means, if something is essential, it just means our body isn't producing it by itself, and so we do need to consume it externally.
Totally.
So again, this is where we just talk a little bit about variety and everything. Because if someone is getting a variety in their diet, they're most likely getting all of those amino acids and everything. So we could, of course, do even a separate video on plant-based proteins versus like animal-based proteins. But I feel like this was such a good intro to what role protein plays in our bodies.
Totally. Yeah, I feel like that's, for the people who don't know that, or don't know about like essential amino acids, right? Like I think that's a really good reminder. And that's what we mean when we say like, what is a complete protein? A complete protein is going to be a source of protein that gives you all of the essential amino acids, which I'm pretty sure all animal sources of
Mhm.
protein are complete proteins. And so it is kind of like that's why it's more of a consideration for vegetarian, like vegan individuals.
Yep, absolutely.
Sweet.
Cool. Well, tell
Well,
us a
let's
little
talk
bit
a
about
little bit about
that.
that. Yeah. Um, so sources, or not sources, I'm getting ahead of myself. So fat, fat breaks down, it's interesting because it's like fat breaks down into fatty acids. And so it's like not as like different from, right? Like I feel like it's like carbs, glucose, protein, amino acids, and then fat breaks into fatty acids. Fat is really important for absorption of vitamins, right? So vitamins A, D, E, and K actually won't be like absorbed or utilized by our body if we are not also consuming sufficient sources of fat, essentially. Fat, I also think about like is important for obviously like maybe not obviously, but like for brain function. So a lot of our brain is kind of like made up of fat. And I also think about fat as like longevity, right? So like fat is important for longer term energy, right? Whereas like carbs can be used as energy like really quickly and efficiently. Fat is really good for kind of like when we need kind of like longer term storage. And I think about longevity with fat because um, all of our cells are like made up of like essentially like the outer coating of the cell that separates the cell from like the external part of like your body is what's called the phospholipid bilayer. And so anytime we hear lipid, that's going to be fat, right? And so fat is actually like making up like the integrity of all of your cells. And it's why it's like really important for like cell turnover. But yeah, that's normally what I think about when I think about fat. Is there anything else that you add to that?
Yeah, the only other thing I add is how important fat is in like hormone production and regulation in the body. And so we do want to make sure we're getting enough fats for our hormones to again like be functioning optimally. And I know hormones are kind of a hot topic right now. And so I think just yeah, really prioritizing consistent, adequate fat intake is really important for all of that.
Totally. Yeah. And with fat and hormones, I think it's like specifically like there's a few hormones, but like specifically like sex hormones, right? So like things that have to do with like reproduction, etc. Fat sources are really important for that. So yeah, I think that's a really good reminder.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Anna, talk to us a little bit about the sources of macronutrients. So, what foods have
Totally.
protein? What foods have carbohydrates and fats?
Yeah, totally. So, when we're talking about like sources of each of the macronutrients, it's very rare to find something that like will only be a source of one thing. So a lot of times we're talking about like primary sources of things, right? So when I think about like carbohydrates, I'm thinking any like wheat-based product, right? So like pastas, breads, that kind of thing. I also think about like rice, so any like grain-based product, right? So like rice, quinoa is a source of carbohydrates. There are also some, like, I think a lot of times people talk about like fruit as a carb or like some vegetables as a carb. For the purposes of like our work, I usually put fruit and vegetables in the category of like color or like more so like micronutrients. But the vegetables or like, kind of like the things that I would probably say are like more sufficiently concentrated with carbohydrates would be things like corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, right? Like that kind of thing would be a source of carbohydrates for me. Any that I'm missing as I'm kind of going through that you kind of normally talk about?
Oats is one I'll throw in
Yes.
there too,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
it's
yeah.
grain, but yeah, oats,
Totally.
just like regular potatoes could
Yeah.
serve as a carbohydrate source. Um, yeah, I feel like that really covers it. And then, like to branch out into like from the wheat and everything, it's like cereals and all of that, couscous, like there's so many different s- foods that did you try? Sorry, my watch started talking to me. There are so many different foods that we, are kind of like wheat or grain based that are the carbohydrate sources.
Totally. And then actually one that I forgot that like I think it's a good bridge into them like protein sources is beans, right? So
Yeah.
like beans are going to be a source of carbohydrates and of protein. And like beans are kind of like that unique one where it's like it's a major source of like both of those things, right? And so a lot of times the beans might be the source of carbohydrates at your meal. The beans might be the source of protein at your meal, and like both are appropriate as long as you're getting enough carbs and protein at the meal, right? So sources of protein would also be, right, like we said already, like meat sources of protein, like animal sources of protein, so like chicken, beef, lamb, all of that kind of thing. Sources of protein would also be like dairy products, right? So like cheese is going to have protein in it. Milk is normally going to have like protein in it, that kind of thing. Also, like plant-based sources of protein would be something more like edamame or like tofu. There's also, I'm trying to remember that it's like satay. What is that called? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about.
It's okay. Basically, it's like a soy-based protein, so it's like edamame, soy, tofu, etc.
Mhm.
But that's what I talk about when I talk about plant-based sources of protein and just sources of protein in general. Is there anything that you feel like I missed or that like you kind of add in there?
Fish would be another one,
Yeah.
which
God.
kind of, yeah, kind of depending on someone's dietary needs, we could throw it in the meat category or just kind of let it be its own. And then eggs. Eggs is another one that is high in
Yeah.
protein.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And then what I think, just like beans were a good bridge between carbs and protein, I feel like dairy products like cheese, milk, etc., is a good bridge between protein and fat, where it's like normally dairy products will also be a pretty good source of fat, and can be like primary of like each of those. When I'm thinking about sources of fat, I'm also talking about like usually like oil-based like dressings or like oils in general. I'm thinking about like avocado, nuts, which can also be a source of protein. Let's see. Yeah, like cheeses, like we said already. Olives are a great source of fat. Any other fat sources that you'll talk about?
Yeah, again, there's just overlap. So like fattier fish, like
Yes,
salmon, it's going to be
totally.
a really good source of fat and protein. Seeds is another one.
Yes.
that will have fat. But yeah, definitely the oils and avocado and dairy products and nuts are really good sources of
Big
fats.
hitters.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, totally.
Awesome. Yeah, so that kind of covers, the different foods that fall into each category. How about some common misconceptions about macronutrients as a whole or kind of individual macronutrients that we've talked about today?
Totally. So I think what comes to mind for me is like it does feel like we kind of culturally like cycle through like different beliefs about all of these. And so what was I gonna say? With it feels like right now there's like a lot of like, okay, carbs are bad. Fat with like the rise of keto, I think was like lauded as like good for a while, but it does feel like right now we're moving more towards like protein, 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 like everything is like fortified with like protein, right? Like that kind of thing. And so a lot of times the way I like to kind of talk through that kind of thing is like, so I think the reason carbs get a bad rap is because a lot of times like the foods that we enjoy are going to have carbohydrates, like are going to be like have like a good amount of like carbohydrates in them. And so I think a lot of times people feel like it's like something that I really enjoy. Maybe I struggle to exert like self-control around or something like that. And so like that must make it like bad. Um, but I really like to come back to like if you're eating like balance and variety, if you're not missing out on like the amount of like carbs that you're eating, right? So like if you are getting sufficient carbs, um, you will have all of that energy for like the processes that you need the energy for. And that a lot of times like what can increase carb cravings, like it kind of becomes a chicken or the egg type of situation where it's like, okay, carbs are bad, so like let me limit my carb intake. Our bodies are like so wired to be sensitive to when we're not getting enough carbs because once again, it is the foundation of all of our energetic processes. And so when we're not getting enough carbohydrates, the body's recourse, like our bodies can't really tell when we are intentionally restricting versus when there is like restriction related to like scarcity in your life, right? Like that there's not enough food. And so the body is like used to being like, oh, okay, like we just need more carbs. So like let's start the carb cravings, like when we get carbs, let's like make sure that we get a good amount because we don't know when the next time we're gonna get them is. And so I think like that wonky relationship with carbs from like a cultural perspective leads people to think like carbs are the problem, which I feel like we could like honestly do like a whole video on that. So I feel like it's like that's like one big misconception is like carbs are bad. I feel like right now, yeah, like with protein, it's like protein is good and it is like objectively good at all times, right? Like we should be doing like protein, 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 which I think is really interesting because in the case where you are like not really getting enough carbs and you are like maybe getting like enough, like you're getting maybe like more than enough protein or like that kind of thing, we might still see actually like muscle loss or like lack of muscle building because your body is probably busy turning a lot of like the protein that you're getting into glucose and it's like um still going to be driving you towards getting like those sources of glucose, or like the sources of like carbohydrates. So I always find that interesting where it's like your body is going to communicate to you like what it is missing, and it's going to try to make do in the short term with the
Yeah,
things that you're giving it, but like in the long term, it might not be like optimal for it. So I think that's when we kind of see people like coming off of like these like diets or like whatever it might be. I feel like it's like that's what I think about when I think of like misconceptions and like the macronutrients.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think ultimately it's kind of coming down to the idea that there isn't like a hierarchical structure with macronutrients.
Totally.
One isn't more important than the other. Really, we need all three, and all three really work together in our bodies
Totally.
to carry out all these necessary functions. And so
Yeah,
there is no, oh, well, I need to make sure I get this, but this macronutrient can be on the back burner. It's like we really need all three. And assuming it's accessible, we need all three all throughout the day.
totally. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. I think like the last thing I'll add is just like um it does feel like as a culture, like we have, or like as a like Western culture, like whatever it might be, we have a really hard time just having like a neutral relationship with all of them, right? Like it needs to be that either like they are like good or they are bad instead of it just being like they are all necessary and like they all kind of like perform their own tasks, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I feel like really we could talk about macronutrients all day long. So if anyone has questions, definitely leave them below. We can go into more depth about any of the macronutrients or kind of concepts around macronutrients and how we consume them and all of that. But I feel like this was a really good intro to macronutrients as a topic. And thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.
See you all the next video.